So this is the second part of your lecture for this week. We're going to be looking at the 1970s, which was also known as the Unraveling. So like I said in the last lecture, we are going to look at kind of the tail end of the 1960s and a couple things that happened. So the crises of 1968. So we have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So Martin Luther King Jr. on March 29th, 1968, he went to Memphis, Tennessee in support of the Black sanitary public works employees who were represented by AFSCME. The workers had been on strike since March 12th for higher wages and better treatment. So King was fatally shot by James Earl Ray at 6:01 p.m. Thursday, April 4th, 1968, as he stood on his motel's second floor balcony. So the bullet entered his right cheek, smashing his jaw, then traveled down his spinal cord before lodging in his shoulder. Okay, so Martin Luther King was assassinated when he was visiting Memphis, Tennessee. So not long after that, we have the assassination of Robert Kennedy. So Robert Kennedy was the brother of JFK. So Kennedy was an American lawyer and politician who served as the 64th United States Attorney General from January 1961 to September 1964. He was also a U.S. Senator from New York, which he served from January 1965 until his assassination in June 1968. So Kennedy scored major victories when he won both the California and South Dakota primaries on June 4th, and he addressed his supporters shortly after midnight on June 5th, 1968, in a ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. After he left the ballroom, he went through the hotel kitchen after being told it was a shortcut to a press room. He did this despite being advised by his bodyguard, former FBI agent Bill Barry, to avoid the kitchen. In a crowded kitchen passageway, Kennedy turned to his left and shook hands with a hotel busboy, Juan Romero, just as a 24-year-old Palestinian opened fire with a revolver. Kennedy was hit 3 times, and 5 other people were wounded. And so we have the Chicago riots. So the 1968 Chicago riots lasted from April 5th to April 7th, 1968, and they were sparked by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Rioting and looting followed, with people flooding out onto the streets of major cities. Soon, riots began, primarily in Black urban areas. Okay, so a major part of the 1960s and the 1970s was the Vietnam War. So we touched on it a little bit when we looked at the 1960s, but we'll look at it a little bit more right now. So just to give you a timeline of Vietnam and the Vietnam War, it lasted from 1955 to 1975. This was a conflict between North Vietnam and its allies in South Vietnam, known as the Viet Cong, against the government of South Vietnam and its main ally, which was the United States. So what was the difference between North and South Vietnam? North Vietnam wanted to unify the country under a single communist regime, whereas South Vietnam wanted to preserve a Vietnam which was more closely aligned with the West and Western values. So in 1965, U.S. troops were introduced to Vietnam, and in 1969, only 4 years later, more than 500,000 military personnel were stationed in Vietnam. U.S. combat units were withdrawn by 1973, and in 1975, South Vietnam fell to a full-scale invasion by the North. Okay, so we have a lot of protests against the Vietnam War during this time. The movement against U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War began on college campuses. And the reason why it began on college campuses is because a lot of people that were just getting out of high school in their early years of college, they were being drafted in the Vietnam War. So this gained national momentum in 1965 after the United States began bombing North Vietnam. Anti-war marches and other protests peaked in early 1968 after the successful Tet Offensive by North Vietnamese troops, which proved that the war's end was nowhere in sight. So the Tet Offensive it lasted a pretty long time, from January 31st, 1968 to September 23rd, 1968. So this was a coordinated series of North Vietnamese attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam. The offensive was an attempt to foment rebellion among the South Vietnamese population and encourage the United States to scale back its involvement in the Vietnam War. Okay, so here's a video of Walter Cronkite in Vietnam. Walter Cronkite was really important during the Vietnam War. He was an American broadcast journalist who served as anchorman for the CBS Evening News for 19 years. During the 1960s and 1970s, he was often cited as the most trusted man in America after being so named in an opinion poll. So he's really one of the major people who reported on the Vietnam War.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
That was Walter Cronkite 50 years ago tonight. 33 days later, President Johnson announced he would not run for re-election. Years later, Cronkite reflected on Johnson's decision.
I don't think our broadcast had a principal effect on that, but I think it was a straw on the back of a lot of indications that he was unhappy with the progress of the war and thought he himself ought to get out.
For it seems...
Okay, so here is what the Vietnam draft lottery looked like. Okay, because we did have a lot of Americans being drafted for the Vietnam War.
The draft lottery, a live report on tonight's picking of the birthdays for the draft.
And now a page from our Sunday morning almanac, December 1st, 1969, 50 years ago today. The night of America's first military draft lottery since 1942. With the war in Vietnam as a backdrop and the futures of some 850,000 young men on the line, the lottery featured a bin containing 366 capsules, one for each possible birthday. The order in which their birthdays were drawn from that bin would determine the order in which those young men would be drafted. First chosen, first to serve. Congressman Alexander Perney of New York drew the first number.
September 14th.
Capsule by capsule, date by date, the board filled up.
December 6th.
Finally concluding with June 8th as number 366. Statisticians soon cried foul, arguing that birth dates near the end of the year had inadvertently been clustered toward the top of the bin, making them more likely to be drawn first.
January 31st, February 16th, March 8th.
Fair or not, as events played out, only men with birthdays numbered 1 through 195 were ultimately called to duty. Men with the remaining 171 birthdays were home free. America ended the military draft in 1973 and has relied on voluntary enlistment ever since. But for many of the thousands who watched the drawing with bated breath, memories of that draft lottery telecast remain as vivid as ever.
Okay, so with the Vietnam draft lottery, like you just saw, essentially how it worked is they would just pull out a day of the year, and if you were born on that day, there was a good chance that you would be drafted to go fight in Vietnam. So we have even more protests now after the introduction of the draft, because people are upset that we're sending so many of America's young men to go fight in a war that's halfway across the world. So an important part of the Vietnam War was this thing called Agent Orange. So this was a herbicide used by the U.S. military for control of vegetation. It was named for the orange band around the storage barrel, and the military sprayed Agent Orange and other tactical herbicides during the Vietnam War.
What do you get when you mix 2,4,5-T acid and 2,4-D acid? You get a powerful herbicide that the United States military used during the Vietnam War, and one that's been tied to serious health problems for the people exposed to it. The answer is Agent Orange. Agent Orange was just one of a series of heavy-duty chemicals the U.S. military used in Southeast Asia, called rainbow herbicides. There were also agents blue, pink, green, purple, and white, but orange was the big one. Some 20 million gallons were sprayed on Southeast Asian jungles, fields, and other targets over a 9-year period from 1962 to 1971. It was part of what the U.S. military called Operation Ranch Hand, aiming to defoliate the South Vietnamese countryside. The goal was to rob the Viet Cong of food sources and places to hide. This kind of scorched earth fighting, clearing the land of anything the enemy could use, is an ancient military tactic. But using chemicals to do that was a pretty recent invention. England and the US developed tactical herbicides during World War II, but didn't really use them. Herbicidal warfare was first used by the British in the 1950s in what's now Malaysia. The US saw that and said, that could work for us in Vietnam. Thus, Operation Ranch Hand. But it would come with a price. In addition to those two chemicals I mentioned earlier, Agent Orange also contains something else called TCDD, the most toxic of a class of chemicals called dioxins. Dioxins are dangerous, even in minute amounts. Veterans returning from Vietnam started reporting these health problems in increasing numbers: cancer, birth defects, miscarriages, and skin diseases, among other issues. Over 2.5 million U.S. soldiers were exposed to Agent Orange during the war. And let's not forget about the Vietnamese. Researchers in Vietnam claim that some 2 million cancers and other diseases, and 500,000 birth defects, were caused in that country by exposure to Agent Orange. And despite some bilateral cleanup efforts, the chemicals continue to pollute the soil there to this day. The fighting in Vietnam may be long over, but its legacy haunts both sides of the conflict, thanks in part to Agent Orange.
Young people.
So now we're going to look at the politics of love, sex, and gender during the 1970s. Okay, so the first thing we are going to look at in the 1970s is Roe versus Wade.
Most Supreme Court decisions are granular, little noticed interpretations of the law and Constitution, but a few are landmarks. Roe v. Wade was a landmark. It effectively legalized abortion across the United States. Here are the facts and players in the case. Jane Roe was actually Norma McCorvey. She was a Texan in her early 20s who wanted to terminate an unwanted pregnancy in 1969. Abortion was legal in Texas at the time, but only for the purpose of saving a woman's life. That was not the issue for McCorvey. Her life was not at risk. She tried unsuccessfully to get an illegal abortion and was referred to 2 attorneys interested in challenging anti-abortion laws. The Wade in Roe v. Wade was Henry Wade, the district attorney of Dallas County, who enforced that Texas abortion law. McCorvey soon filed a case against him. The Supreme Court agreed in 1971 to hear the case, and on January 22nd, 1973, struck down the Texas law in a 7-2 decision. Justice Harry Blackmun wrote for the majority opinion and declared a woman's right to privacy under the 14th Amendment superseded a state's right to ban abortion. The court set different rules for each trimester. In the first trimester, the choice to end pregnancy was entirely up to the mother. In the second trimester, the government could regulate but not ban abortion in order to protect the mother's health. In the third trimester, the state could prohibit abortion to protect a fetus that could survive outside the womb, except when the mother's health is in danger. Justices Byron White and William Rehnquist dissented. They basically held the argument of privacy went far beyond the intentions of the constitutional framers, an argument that could signal the grounds for challenges to Roe. The two justices also stated the court's decision did not stick to the specific facts of this case because Roe was not in her first trimester at the time of the litigation. Public opinion was quickly shifting. In August 1972, Americans opposed legalized abortion, 46 to 42%. But by April 1973, it was 52 to 41 in favor. In the years since, Roe's been modified but not overturned. A notable example was in 1992, a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. For all intents and purposes, this is the new standard by which abortion cases are judged. The focus this time wasn't privacy, it was roadblocks, which had been intentionally set up to make it harder to get an abortion. In a 5-4 ruling, the court said restrictions are unconstitutional if they place an undue burden on a woman. Support for Roe v. Wade remains strong. A Kaiser Family Foundation poll in June 2018 found that 67% of Americans do not want the Supreme Court to overturn the ruling, while 29% do. The question now, of course, is what the Supreme Court will do with a solid conservative majority.
So understanding Roe versus Wade is really important because it's something that the Supreme Court is looking at, and it's been a pretty important issue really ever since Roe versus Wade was passed, and as different cases about abortion get brought to the Supreme Court. Okay, so with women's rights during the 1970s, we have Pauli Murray. So she was an American civil rights activist who became a lawyer, women's rights activist, and she was also a priest and author. So she was drawn to the ministry in 1977, and she was the first African American woman to be ordained as a priest, as an Episcopal priest. In the first year that any women were ordained by that church. Okay, next we have the Stonewall riots.
In the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, a riot broke out in front of the Stonewall Inn in New York City. The violent protest became known as the Stonewall Riots. The Stonewall Riots were a watershed moment in the gay rights movement, sparking activism and awareness across the United States. We'll look at the roots of the riots, the events, and their lasting impact. In the 1950s and 60s, homosexuality was still considered sodomy and illegal in 49 states. The punishments varied greatly by state, ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment. In society, members of the gay community were often subject to violence, harassment, and discrimination. In New York City, gay bars were havens for people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, places where they could avoid harassment and violence. The Stonewall Inn served as a popular refuge. The Stonewall Inn was owned by the Mafia. The Mafia bribed the police to look the other way. In turn, the Mafia made money overcharging patrons for drinks. Even so, the patrons were not fully safe from homophobia and discrimination. The Mafia would extort wealthy patrons, threatening to out them to their employers and families. Despite the Mafia's bribes, the police still regularly raided the Stonewall Inn and other gay bars, charging them with solicitation of homosexual relations. Trans and other gender nonconforming people were also targeted, subjected to violence, and arrested if they weren't wearing what the police deemed gender-appropriate clothing. This oppression and mistreatment came to a head in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969. 9 police officers entered the Stonewall Inn in a raid. The patrons were fed up. As the police roughly tried to arrest bartenders and customers, many resisted. Outside the bar, people in the hundreds began rioting. They threw bottles at the police and pushed through the barricades. The police officers retreated from the crowd and locked themselves inside the Stonewall Inn. Rioters responded by setting the bar on fire. Police reinforcement arrived, and the original officers managed to get out of the burning bar. Meanwhile, the angry mob had grown into thousands. Eventually, the police were able to get the crowd to disperse, but it didn't last long. The riots continued until July 1st. While some criticized the violent and destructive riots, others pointed to the brutality and unjust treatment of the gay community. This large-scale defiance made a massive impact on society. The Stonewall riots were the beginning of the modern gay liberation movement, which also brought attention to others marginalized for their sexual or gender orientation. The riots sparked the formation of the Gay Liberation Front, the first group to publicly advocate for equal gay rights. On the one-year anniversary of the riots, they also organized the first Gay Pride Parade. Today, Pride events are still held on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots in cities around the country and even the world. In 2016, President Obama made the Stonewall Inn and the area outside where the riots broke out a national monument. This became the first national monument celebrating gay history. The Stonewall riots may have been violent, but they marked a pivotal moment in history. No longer would people quietly endure the stigma associated with their sexual and gender orientations. Through the Stonewall riots, the gay rights movement gained mainstream visibility and a momentum that continues to this day.
Okay, so with the Stonewall riots, this became a really important time in American history when discussing rights for the gay community. Okay, so next we have the battle to pass the ERA. So the ERA, which was the Equal Rights Amendment, was about getting equality for women, which we talked about during the lecture for the 1960s. So the Equal Rights Amendment said that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So the versions of this amendment were introduced every year since 1923, but it did not until it finally passed and went to the states for ratification in 1972. In 1977, Indiana became the 35th and final state to ratify the amendment. The amendment needed only 3 more states for ratification. So in order to ratify an amendment, you need 3/4 of the states to approve. So the Equal Rights Amendment got just below that. They needed 3 more to get that 3/4 approval. In 1982, the time limit for ratification expired, and along with it, the amendment. So one of the major people who opposed the ERA was Phyllis Schlafly. So Phyllis was an American attorney, conservative, and author, and she held very conservative social and political views. She opposed feminism, gay rights, and abortion, and successfully campaigned against ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So she really fought for women to be able to have their traditional roles as homemakers and as wives and as mothers. And some people criticized her for this, for kind of wanting women to stay in those roles, whereas that's not how she lived her life. She was very similar to feminists at the time, where she had a family, but she also went out and worked. Okay, so we have more opposition to the ERA from Jerry Falwell. So he said, "It is now time to take a stand on certain moral issues. We must stand against the Equal Rights Amendment, the feminist revolution, and the homosexual revolution. We must have a revival in this country." So Falwell was an American Southern Baptist pastor, televangelist, and conservative activist. He was the founding pastor of the Thomas Road Baptist Church, which was a mega church in Lynchburg, Virginia. Okay, so now we're going to look at Richard Nixon. So remember from 1960 that Richard Nixon ran for president against JFK, but he did not win. Okay, now we see him run again in the election of 1968. So in the election of 1968, we see that Nixon once again ran as the Republican candidate, and he really got a lot of states that are all over the place, or more so the Democratic candidate got a bunch of states that were kind of seems a little bit random. But Wallace, who ran as a third party, his vote tally of 46 votes was the most recent election that a third party candidate has won electoral votes. So as we can see here, like for example, North Carolina, most of the state voted for Nixon, but where it says one, it has like the yellow gold color, that means that the third party candidate, Wallace, was able to get one of those votes. So the issues of the day were the Vietnam War, the civil rights, and the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King. Okay, so Nixon's presidency, his presidency focused on American foreign policy. So he denounced previous administration's willingness to commit American forces to third world conflicts and warned other states to assume responsibility for their own defense. So we see this is different from when Lyndon B. Johnson was president. So taking advantage of tensions between communist China and the Soviet Union, Nixon pursued closer relations with both in order to de-escalate tensions and strengthen the United States' position relative to each country. Okay, which is why it is very important. As we saw here, Nixon visited communist China. So his visit to China was from February 21st, 1972 to February 28th, 1972. So he was only there for a week, but it was important because one of his goals was to solidify our relationship with other countries. And so it was important for him to take that step in order to trying to smooth over relations with China. So then we have the 1972 election. So as we can see from the election map, it's pretty unbelievable with how popular Nixon has become. So at the last election map of 1968, Nixon obviously won by a decent margin, but the margin for the 1972 election is pretty crazy. So the Democratic candidate won DC, Massachusetts, and was able to get one vote from Virginia. So during this election cycle, the 26th Amendment was ratified, which allowed 18-year-olds to vote. We see vice presidential succession come into play again as Nixon resigned on August 9th, 1974, and was replaced by his vice president, Gerald R. Ford. So actually the one vote in Virginia was for a third-party candidate, John Hospers. So the issues of the day were the Vietnam War and international relations. So specifically with the USSR, China, and then dealing with Watergate. So what was the Watergate scandal? So 5 men working for Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate complex to repair a bugging device installed during an earlier break-in. So the men were discovered and arrested, and over the next 2 years, Americans learned that Nixon and his associates had engaged in a lot of abuses of power. So the most damaging blow struck when a White House aide discovered that all conversations in the Oval Office were taped. Okay, so here we see pretty much just Nixon abusing his power, and which kind of forces the American public to not trust him or the government. Okay, so technically Nixon is not impeached. He resigns before they can ever start that process. And so his vice president, Ford, becomes president. Okay, so we see the Watergate scandal and its impact on the 1976 election. So Ford was never elected president. He was president because Nixon resigned, and then when he ran on his own, he lost against Jimmy Carter. So perhaps the Watergate scandal did have some impact on the 1976 election, as we see a Democratic candidate winning over a Republican candidate. So the 1976 election, Ford won Washington up in the left corner, but we see where we have that one vote. One person or elector voted for Ronald Reagan. So the issue of the day was the Watergate scandal, impeachment, and the pardon of Nixon. Okay, because Ford, after he became president, pardoned Richard Nixon. Okay, so we're going to look at Carter's presidency. So Carter, like Ford, who was just president before him, they presided over a very unique economic dilemma. So there was inflation and also economic stagnation, which became known as stagflation. So many American manufacturers perceived only one path to sustaining profits, and this was moving overseas because it was cheaper, and they often did this by establishing foreign subsidiaries or partnering with foreign firms. So neither Ford nor Carter had the means or ambition to protect American jobs and goods from foreign competition. So we see kind of a decrease in employment and the selling of American goods because these jobs are being moved over to foreign firms and they're starting to produce goods for America. So Carter's foreign policy. So the United States either reduced or eliminated aid to American-supported right-wing dictators guilty of extreme human rights abuses in places like South Korea, Argentina, and the Philippines. So America is really only going to show support for countries whose ideals align with America and like Western philosophy. So they start to reduce their aid to dictators who are abusing their power. So in September 1977, Carter negotiated the return of the Panama Canal, which cost him enormous political capital in the United States. So it seems like a nice move for him to return Panama to the Panama Canal. A lot of people weren't super happy with that decision. So in September 1978, a year later, he negotiated a peace treaty between the Israeli prime minister and the Egyptian president. So here we see Carter kind of act as like a go-between and try to form peace between other countries. So the United States continued to provide military and financial support for countries that had dictators, which were vital to American interests, such as countries like Iran, which is rich with oil. Okay, so towards the end of the 1970s, probably the most important thing that happened was the Iranian hostage crisis.
The special report that we planned to bring you tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home. Some 60 Americans including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. It's Friday morning there now. But throughout this night in Washington, officials will continue their search for some way to negotiate the hostages' freedom. That search was not successful today. In this broadcast, we'll have reports on the diplomatic efforts to resolve the problem and on other aspects of the crisis as well. But we begin now with an on-the-scene account by the one American television correspondent who has been there since the beginning, the seizure of the embassy last Sunday, and who, with his crew, has provided us with outstanding coverage all this week. Here is Bob Dyke in Tehran.
This picture tells it all. This flag was apparently taken from someone's office inside the United States Embassy. It was burned Tuesday evening outside the embassy's gates. To the Iranian demonstrators who set fire to it, this was a symbol of victory. 2 days earlier, several hundred young people, mainly students at Tehran University, have taken over the embassy. We are not occupiers, they said. We have thrown out the occupiers. But instead of chasing all the Americans out of the compound, the Iranians imprisoned them in a building somewhere on these grounds. They have been hostages ever since. This morning, for the first time since the hostages were put under lock and key, one of the captives, blindfolded, was brought out into the open. He is Harry Rosen, the embassy's press attaché. He was turned to face reporters and cameramen and several hundred Iranian demonstrators outside the embassy's gates. "Yankee, go home," they cried, but they made no attempt to harm him. Eventually, he was led back to join the other captives who have been kept out of sight. But this young woman was released a few hours after the embassy was seized Sunday. She worked there as a low-level interpreter. She is an Iranian who spent time studying in the United States, and her name is Fareshta Imami. And she recalls how the embassy fell. You were at the embassy when it was taken over on Sunday.
Yes, I was.
What happened?
About 10:15, a group of demonstrators came in front of the building, in front of the embassy compound, and they walked in.
They walked in?
They actually
Did
walked
anyone try to stop them?
in. No, I don't believe so.
Because?
They said that they just wanted to stage a sit-in, and
What
they didn't
happened
want
next?
to harm anyone. They came in front of the chancellery. We saw them through the window. They had a banner saying, "We don't want to harm anyone. We just want to stage a sit-in."
How did the people at the embassy react to that, the guards?
We were taken on the second floor, maximum security floor, and we were given tear gas masks, and we were told to stay calm.
What happened after that?
A couple of hours went by, and we heard a siren. When I asked one of the Marines what had happened, they said that they had stormed the building.
They, meaning the students?
The students, yes. They
What
came inside the
happened? What
building.
happened after that?
Well, they came behind the door where we were held, and they said, if you all get out, and if you don't resist, we will not harm anyone, and we just want to stage a sit-in, and we just want to ask a couple of questions. So they came in, the Marines opened the door, and they came in, and they took all of us, blindfolded us, tied our hands behind our backs, and they took us.
Did any of you try to resist?
No, none of us.
Were any shots fired during the takeover?
No, just tear gas canisters.
Were any of the students armed?
No, none of them were armed. A couple of them had sticks.
Were there any fights?
No, no scuffles, no fights.
No scuffles between the U.S. Embassy personnel?
No, everything was calm.
It was another small victory for the activists who are fully backed by their country's supreme ruler, the Ayatollah Khomeini. It seems the Iranian students have the initiative. The next move is evidently up to the United States.
Okay, so with the Iranian hostage crisis, this happened on November 4th, 1979, and 52 United States diplomats and citizens were held hostage after a group of militarized Iranian college students belonging to the Muslim student followers who supported the Iranian Revolution took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and seized hostages. And so this is a very important event which took place in 1979, which lasted until January 20th, 1981. So American politics and society remained in flux throughout the 1970s. So we could see from the last 2 decades that there was a lot of weakness in America. So, and we mostly see this because the world's greatest military power had not done super well in Vietnam. An American president stood flustered by Middle Eastern revolutionaries because Carter wasn't really sure how to react or how to deal with the hostage crisis. The cultural clashes from the 60s persisted and accelerated. Cities burned, and more liberal sexuality permeated American culture. The economy crashed, and American cities were prone to poverty and crime, and its working class was gutted by deindustrialization and globalization. So by 1980, many Americans, especially white middle and upper class Americans, felt a nostalgic desire for simpler times and simpler answers to the complex geopolitical, social, and economic problems crippling the nation. So we'll look at it next week. We see with the election of 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan to presidential office, and the hope that he could answer some of these questions for Americans.